Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 319, Culinary Midrash. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we continue our series on Jewish food with our guest, who is the author of one of the best titled books in the field of Jewish studies, and it's also a great read. Our guest's book, which came out in 2018, is called Gastronomic Judaism as Culinary Midrash. Midrash being, as we have talked about before, a form of Jewish commentary on older texts that generally takes the form of additional storytelling, but Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus helps us see Jewish foodways as a kind of midrash. Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus is professor of religion and Henrietta Jennings Faculty Chair for Outstanding Teaching at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. In addition to his book, Gastronomic Judaism as Culinary Midrash, Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus has published numerous articles on food rituals and Jewish food, including a chapter on Jewish food in the medieval era in the wonderful collection Feasting and Fasting, The History and Ethics of Jewish Food. Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus has also translated into English a 14th century Hebrew mystical manual on food called Shulchan Shel Arba, Table of Four, written by Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, and that is available for free on Sefaria. He is currently working on a book on the myths and meal rituals of American Thanksgiving. Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus holds a PhD in religious studies focused on the New Testament from Vanderbilt University, and he is ordained as a Reconstructionist rabbi, where the focus presumably was on the Old Testament. But we want to talk about food. So Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I wanted to start in maybe kind of a strange place, but at least I think that this is an interesting case study because I think it's a kind of Jewish food being imagined and created in real time that we have been observing for, a generation or two. And I don't think we've completely profoundly understood what's going on. And I would love to unpack it with you, which is specifically Chinese food on Christmas. Because I think that is, I want to take it really seriously as the emergence of a way of Jewish eating and one that may be still in creation. Because I was thinking about it a little bit and wondering whether one could imagine that practice would evolve over time such that rather than what we do now, which is to get takeout during COVID or in the past time to go to a Chinese restaurant on Christmas. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, at least in legend, that's all that was open on Christmas, et cetera. And I was thinking, we're in the process of renovating our kitchen, and I'm thinking about cooking a lot more. And I'm thinking about, well, maybe I would then on Christmas create kind of a Jewish-Chinese fusion type of recipes. And then I was kind of thinking nobody in my family would really want that. What they really want is to go to the Chinese restaurant. So I'm wondering whether we could reflect on...
That is a very good point. Is that we have to have our pure Chinese food, Chinese American fusion foods, and Jewish American fusion foods. It is much discussed, and people do write learned papers about Jews and Chinese food. So yeah, I don't write a lot about it. I certainly have talked a little bit about transgressive Jewish eating, and that's a good example. But no, it's more the thing that I just have to do on Erev, what I like to call Erev Christmas, the Eve, Christmas Eve in Hebrew. This year I was out of town, so I think we did Chinese Erev on Christmas Eve, and I think we also did it on Christmas Day as well.
You talked about transgressive Jewish eating, and I really want to talk about that down the road. That's the idea that, right, maybe, and we talked about this at one point. We had an episode where we talked to the people who reenacted the Treifa banquet, which was this famous non-kosher meal at the Hebrew Union College. But actually, I was thinking about this question about whether eating Chinese food on Christmas has a transgressive element to it, because I was thinking about, I could imagine, in fact, I have been there, where there are a bunch of Jews eating Chinese food on Christmas, and somebody orders mushu pork, for example, and I don't think that person thinks it's transgressive at all, right? Meaning, I think what that person has in their mind is that it is a Jewish custom to eat Chinese food on Christmas, and it doesn't matter whether it's kosher or not. That doesn't even enter the person's mind. They feel like they're doing a Jewish act.
We were just watching Midlife Crisis, the episode on Christmas. And in fact, one of the scenes that they show in that is this one Jewish family, this woman insisting that she didn't get pork in her in her dish because we keep kosher. So she says that. But I would probably agree with you. I actually don't think eating Chinese food on Christmas Eve is transgressive for most Jews. It's Jewish. It's how you express. And on the other hand, you can ask the question, why dafka Chinese food? Why precisely Chinese food? And I think that gets to it. Why is Chinese food different from all other tray foods? And David Kramer, talks a lot about safe trafe and why it is, and he has a nice discussion of that. But there are things that people say, like it doesn't mix milk with meat. And my favorite is, and that was kind of always my sort of, I suppose, my internal logic is you cut it up in tiny enough pieces and it's not trafe anymore. I mean, or it doesn't feel like it doesn't, I can't see it. I mean, I do keep kosher, so I don't eat trafe on the evening of Christmas. But, I think some people have even people who don't keep kosher sometimes have a visceral dislike for certain kinds of foods that are treif. I mean, like, ham just, it just doesn't look good to me. Now, pepperoni, that's something different. Not that I eat it, but I used to, and it looks delicious.
First off, to our listeners, please read Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus's book, Gastronomic Judaism as Culinary Midrash. It's about food, and it's about Jewish relationships to food, but it's also much more than just food. By the way, I don't even like the phrase just food. That's part of the point of your book. But this is a really beautiful entryway into thinking about how Judaism works or how Judaisms work generally. So starting there, but your book begins in a really interesting place, and you throw out some fascinating terms. The title, gastronomic Judaism, that's a claim that, what's happening in our bodies when we eat is a kind of Judaism, right? We shouldn't skate right on by that, because some people would say that's just, Jewishness or Jewish culture or something. So gastronomic Judaism. And then you add on to that, you say gastronomic Judaism as culinary midrash. We've talked about Midrash on this show before. I'm not going to say my definition of what Midrash is because I want it to be your definition of what Midrash is.
Okay.
But what does it mean? What does gastronomic Judaism mean, to start? Why is it culinary Midrash? And how might that title and the beginning of your book help us think about what Jewish food is and how it works differently?
Okay, so one of the impetus for writing the book is that if I were to steal Rachel Gross's title for her book and say Beyond the Synagogue, I could have called my book Beyond Kosher, because I think that's the first thing that I wanted to start out with, is that for most, or for many Jewish people, that is not exactly the one thing that makes food Jewish for them. For many people, it has a lot more to do with holidays. Do I eat this food at certain occasions? For a lot of people, it has to do with family memories. Are these foods that my family, which is Jewish, makes? Let me start with gastronomic Judaism. I picked that because it was originally meant as a dismissive or derogatory term for, it's almost always qualified with that's just gastronomic Judaism and nothing else. I had a terrific student research assistant who did. I asked her, find everything that you can where this term appears. But basically, it was used to suggest, in a dismissive way, that the Jews who identify just by the food that they choose is not really that important. So I deliberately wanted to go after that. It's central. I mean, we just know it is central to people's choices for how they express their Jewish identity, the food that they eat. I mean, that is just so prevalent. And so in that sense, my approach towards food is very, very similar to Rachel Gross's approach towards other kinds of things that aren't classified as like traditionally Jewish religious ways of being religious.
Shout out to our listeners. In the show notes for this episode, you can find Rachel Gross's episode where we talk about some food stuff too. Back to you, Jonathan.
Okay. So, I wanted to go after that. But also the culinary midrash part is really important because in a sense, what I'm saying is that what makes Jewish food is a conscious effort to label it as such. And I see that as very much what midrash, even in its kind of more traditional textual sense, is. Because you're basically saying, what midrash does, and I know you have your definition, but as I understand it, it is a way of taking something traditional and applying it to something else, or something different, or something that the tradition didn't necessarily imagine, to make that thing both relevant and label it as Jewish. I mean, it's a kind of, midrash is sort of a process of intentionally making something Jewish. So the thing is that the possibilities can be infinite. If I'm going to say that eating out on Christmas Eve is Chinese food is Jewish, as long as it's more than just me doing it, let me qualify that. Certainly when lots of people are doing that, there's kind of more of the social phenomenon of something being recognizably, identifiably Jewish. But I think I'm also getting at the fact that subjectively we make this step all the time. I could think of Thanksgiving, growing up, and when we would do Thanksgiving dinner at my family's house, it always felt like we should have the Shabbos candles out, the Shabbat candles out, because it just seemed so. The whole setup, the night, it just reminded me of the way that we would do a Passover Seder, the way that we would do a Shabbat dinner at my grandparents' house. I mean, the kind of aesthetics of a special meal, it just seemed like Thanksgiving is Jewish. But again, it isn't unless you say that. The whole thing of saying a blessing, a bracha, before eating food or before doing anything. I mean, really, if you do it, whatever else it is a way of labeling, especially if you're labeling that action or that activity as being something Jewish, especially if you're doing it in Hebrew, or if you're, and a lot of the Hebrew blessings are kind of sampling the Torah. I mean, I love Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the earth. It's a line from one of the Psalms first of all, I love that we say, "Blessed are you, God, who brings forth bread from the earth," because I made the bread. It did not come forth from the earth. There's a whole story that we're not even telling. I mean, it's very imaginative when we're saying, so that the other thing is that I think all blessings, all of our brachot are midrash, because we're attaching a certain deeper significance to something that we're doing by telling a story that God is somehow involved in it, that, we've just left out all the steps of like people growing wheat and harvesting food. And there's actually a wonderful passage in the Talmud, Ben Zoma, who actually fills in all the steps of what was involved before he's eating a piece of bread that he's saying a blessing over. And that's, it is a creative act.
I had a moment recently, partially in relation to a different essay in the book Feasting and Fasting that you're in, Elaine Goodfriend's piece, where she was talking about biblical Jewish food ways. And it didn't start with kashrut. I mean, you mentioned beyond kosher before, right? Like, it's not about kashrut. If you were to look at the Bible and you had no context, you did, like, an alien comes and is given a copy of the Bible and asked, what is this group of people's like most important foods? They would probably say things like wine and bread and oil.
Oh, and lamb. Don't forget lambs and goats and
right. And those things are not, when you talk to people about Jewish food now, the idea that like bread would be a Jewish food, I think most people, if I said to them, bread is a Jewish food, people would be like, well, yeah, sure. Like there's challah and bread is associated with all sorts of Jewish moments, but like it's not an only Jewish food. And so I think people, therefore, they take away from that. If something is not an only Jewish food, if other people that are not Jewish have a relationship to the food, then somehow it feels to us like it doesn't count or it counts differently. And I would love to hear from you about that, because I think it relates to how we label, like how we make those labeling choices that you mentioned with the blessings.
You learn this in food studies early on, is that there is no authentically something food. You're never going to, I actually was looking for something like that. Is there something that only Jews eat? So I would say it's the Hillel sandwich at Passover. And again, that's not even true, because if you have non-Jews at your Seder, they're eating it too. But nonetheless, right. It is something that you, and I often come back to it as, I would say it is the quintessential Jewish food. And this is why. One, you eat it at a Jewish holiday, and you only eat it at a Jewish holiday. It's like, who eats Hillel sandwiches any other time of the year? Who eats charoset, the kind of fruity filling that goes in inside of it any other time of the year? And then I always have my friends who say, well, we eat it afterwards because we have lots of leftover. And then I think Ben and Jerry's made a charoset ice cream, but I think they only marketed that around Passover anyway. So first of all, it's totally connected to this seasonal celebration. But secondly, I would argue bittersweetness is a Jewish flavor. The whole point of the Hillel sandwich is you're mixing the bitterness of the maror. Maror it literally just means the bitter thing. And, whether it's horseradish, which isn't really bitter, it's spicy, and that's not even get into the, but it makes you cry. So that's the point. And then the matzah, which you wrap it around, which again is quintessentially, even though we know that like other ancient Near Eastern groups like used unleavened bread in their sacrifices, we didn't make that up. We have in the Passover Seder, there are three things, Rabbi Gamliel, these are the three things you have to say or you haven't fulfilled your obligation. First of all, I love that it doesn't say you have to eat them. It only says you have to say them, but it's much better if you eat them because then you remember. All of these things have associations with history, and we're eating them all together in this one sandwich that is mixing the bitter and the painful with the sweet in the context of the recurring story of Jewish history, in which, not to say that they're always out to get us, but as the great Alan King said, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That should be Torah.
It already is Torah in terms of the amount of Jews that are familiar with that verse of words. Like you could compare that to most Torah verses, and I think probably demographically there are more Jews that have heard that. I have started books with that, or at least essays with that. The thing is, so I think that the bittersweet taste is really important. And actually there's a wonderful commentary on it by Sfat Emet, the Hasidic rabbi, who says, that this is the way it is with our experience in the world, is that there is suffering and there is the good things in the world, and it is a mixture of the two. In that sense, I would say it takes a quintessentially Jewish flavor combination, a quintessentially Jewish story, a quintessentially Jewish time of year, puts all of these things together. And so you have what I would say, if I had to pick the most Jewish food, I would say it is the Hillel sandwich.
Can we talk a little bit about some other foods that people think of as quintessentially Jewish foods? And, I don't want to say they're wrong, but it's more interesting than that. And now I want to talk about Ashkenazi foods because I'm Ashkenazi and I know it best, not because it's the most important. I'm talking about, like, for example, matzo ball soup, or, for example, challah as we know it, the eggy bread. There's a whole list of foods that we could list that people say, hey, that is Jewish foods. Now, I'm thinking, as I was thinking about this and preparing for this interview, I was thinking there are all these fusion restaurants that we have in our world today. There's French-Vietnamese fusion because there was an interaction, colonial interaction between France and Vietnam. There are all these fusion foods that we know of. And actually, it would be more correct, I think, to understand much of what we call Jewish food as Jewish something fusion. So matzo ball soup is like Jewish-German fusion. Is the reason why we don't think of it that way just because these things were defined as Jewish foods before the concept of fusion came along? Or is there something deeper in it where maybe it is that the Hillel sandwich is the only food that is quintessentially Jewish, but something quintessentially Jewish is the claiming of things that are actually not Jewish as Jewish? You know, that's
Exactly.
something. Yeah, so say more about that.
Well, okay. So first of all, I think Ashkenazic, Yana Gur, the Israeli food writer, talks about this, that Jewish restaurants in Israel are basically traditional Ashkenazic Jewish food. And if you're going to have Jewish food from Morocco or Jewish food from, Yemenite Jewish food, they're called Yemenite restaurants, or they're called Moroccan restaurants. So there is a certain kind of cultural prejudice or bias towards, almost the same way that kosher functions as kind of a synonym for Jewish. And I kind of noticed that that's the case also with like babka and rugelach. Regardless of what their ingredients are, they have a Yiddish name. And as a Yiddish name, they're categorized as Ashkenazic and they're categorized as Jewish. I was talking about it before of how do we label something as Jewish? Well, we'll say it's kosher, or we'll give it an Ashkenazic name, or we'll give it an Israeli name, or give it a Hebrew name, or we'll associate it with a hamantash. That's a great thing. That's got, it's a Yiddish word, but it also has the bad guy in the Purim story in it too. So there's a wonderful tradition. I think it's a North African tradition, a Jewish tradition, to bake breads that are Haman's face, and then you put eggs for the eyes and things like that. But I love the whole idea is that basically you eat your enemy. That is the ultimate humiliation. That I know there's one of my favorite food writers, Margaret Visser, talks about how do you want to insult somebody? You say, I will drink wine out of your skull.
Or in leftist discourse, you'll say, eat the rich. Right, like that's like a phrase.
Well, let's go eat them instead. In their surrogate forms, in their surrogate delicious forms. Though we should channel our hostile and violent instincts towards eating food. And back to the question about fusion. Why don't we acknowledge them as fusion foods? Why do we call them Jewish foods? And I would say that is part of that's very much related to one of the things I'm getting at and talking about culinary Midrash, is that the constant of Jewish experience is that we've lived in lots of different places. All of our foods are fusion foods. Even the biblical foods are fusion foods because we're taking them from the broader Canaanite and Egyptian and cultural context. They're all things there. I mean, the function of eating kosher foods was not necessarily to distinguish yourselves from other peoples. They all ate the same thing. By calling all of these different kinds of things Jewish foods, it acknowledges that we have been in different places. And I think the thing is that most of the names for a lot of different Jewish foods carry where they're from by their name. So clearly each one of those is reflective of the different places where Jews have lived. All right, so I think a lot about this book that was written in Hebrew about cholent, but its title in Hebrew is chamin, which is the Middle Eastern word that's used for it, although it goes back to the rabbinic term for the Sabbath dish. But it is translated it has like an English title page, and it's translated as cholent. And she talks about all the different kinds of ways that each different Jewish community put their spin on this Sabbath dish, often, with different kinds of ingredients that are typical of the area. And I think that's classic Jewish, because you get something Jewish, but it's also where we live. Okay, I make challah now. I could make it with raisins. I want my challah to be of the region that I live in. So my challah has dried cranberries in it because I live in New England. And, this is my New Englisher challah. To be Jewish is fusion. I mean, in that sense, fusion is Jewish.
I want to add on to that by flashing to an essay you wrote about, of all things, medieval Jewish relationships to food. And so I want to bring it up because a big part of what you write in that essay is that for a long, long, long time, everything you just said is not only true of quote unquote folk Judaism, but it's even true of Jewish legal relationships to food. There's the whole idea that we're not supposed to eat with Gentiles seems to crescendo a lot in the medieval period that you looked at. And
Right.
it relates in particular to a few core issues that you talk about. One is meat and dairy. I loved the way that you explored meat and dairy. And I also think that there's all this stuff that people say about chicken and dairy, like floating around on the internet. And I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions and true conceptions and just different information floating around. And I'd love to hear from you, just like, what's the story with how meat and dairy has evolved over time? And the other piece really is central to questions of whether Jewish food is about fusions, because the relationship to wine in whether it's Jewish text or Jewish communities over time is really interesting. And people today, if you talk to them about kosher wine, usually the first thing that comes up is that non-Jews can't be involved with creating it. And we take for granted that that's kind of the fundamentals of Jewish wine, quote unquote, or kosher wine, quote unquote. And the synonym problem is back again. But what you talk about in this piece of yours is that that's actually not how it seems to have been until this medieval period, which in Jewish time is kind of recent. So I'd love to hear on those two fronts, meat and dairy and wine, how this question of like fusion and avoiding fusion, rabbis saying, no, don't hang out with people around us, don't mix with them, how that comes to pass.
Okay, so speaking both about the relative newness in Jewish history of the radical separation between milk and meat and wine. The wine rules tended to be more to separate Jews from Gentiles. I think the milk meat rules tended to be to separate elite Jews from less elite Jews. This intra-Jewish distinction between and holding up the learned rabbis as being at the top of the social pyramid. Whereas the wine is much more clearly associated with trying to separate Jews from Gentiles. But it's complicated because, first of all, non-Jews were involved in the production of wine, there's no doubt, and continue to be involved in the production of wine. Jewish law found ways to make that possible. And one of the ways is by coming up with this legal fiction that if it wasn't really wine, then Gentiles could touch it and not make it into, not contaminate it with their Gentile idolatriness if you boil it. So basically all kosher wine now, almost all kosher wine is mevushal, is boiled. I tell a story about how, we got unboiled wine for our wedding, and we had to return it because our caterer, who had non-Jewish workers who would be serving it, according to New Jersey state law, he wouldn't have been allowed to call his service kosher if he was doing that. So we had to replace all of our non-boiled wine with boiled wine at the last minute. You don't make rules about drinking wine with Gentiles unless people are doing it. I mean, so, which is all, the great story of all Jewish law is that people come up with these things because they don't like what, certain people have an interest in having people not do things that they're doing. It definitely, the principles behind it are definitely ethically problematic. But then there was also a whole debate, which I get into, is that within the Jewish legal thinkers about whether or not Muslims and Christians were in fact idolaters, because they understood that we can't drink wine poured out to idols, and so. But if Muslims and Christians aren't idolaters. And so there was some debate over that, and there were different positions on that. And so there was there were some legal opinions that said that they did not render Jewish wine unfit for drinking by Jews.
Yeah, and there were things in your book that sort of struck me for the first time. For example, people didn't have forks, for
Yes.
the vast majority of Jewish history. So the idea that, first of all, that brings into a whole new relief all the things about hand washing, whether it's on Passover in general. And also, it also kind of raises this thing like, okay, well, if all these laws emerge in a world without forks, then once forks are invented or popularized, well, there are actually probably going to be two stages to what happens. First of all, the rich people are going to be the ones to get forks first. So they're going to be dealing with this ahead of time. And then the other question is like, well, Who says that the fork can't touch meat and then touch milk and then touch meat again? It's like that has to be invented. And so I'm wondering about the kind of economics of all this too, because there are elements, like I think a lot of us have absorbed this notion about what Jewish food is, for example, that it's poor people's food. But what's interesting is like the other side of that coin, which is that in a world in which realistically people could not afford to have more than one pot of a certain kind, then you can't imagine that it's likely, and in fact it wasn't, that people could only use one pot for milk and, for dairy and one pot for meat. That just can't have been the practice because the vast majority of people couldn't have afforded two pots.
Exactly.
And so then that brings us to like this world in which we live where, and I'm not even talking so much about the people who actually keep kosher today, like they should live and be well and do whatever they want. But I'm talking about the other people who are sort of taught to look at what those people are doing as the righteous way to be a Jew and somehow feel like, well, I'm not really, we don't have separate dishes in my house, so I'm not really a good Jew. But the reality is that stuff is of such recent vintage that I'm just sort of wonder whether there are new ways that we ought to be thinking about it to take that into account. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, it's recent vintage, but now that's the way and that's what it is. Or you could say, well, it's a recent vintage, and therefore if it turns out that this is making life super difficult and expensive for Jews, then maybe we can kind of ratchet back to an earlier understanding of what it meant to eat like a Jew.
I mean, Dan, I would take a different tack on that, being the Reconstructionist rabbi that I am. We keep kosher, but it's like, as long as it's meaningful to me. I mean, that's, whether it's an old kosher practice or whether it's not, I mean, we make if I'm going to buy kosher food, I have to rely on the authorities that say that it's kosher, more or less, unless I'm, getting raw, unprocessed ingredients. And that's fine too. I like to do, I do a lot of my own cooking, so I can do that in a lot of cases. But if I'm going to get kosher meat, I have to rely on the kosher industrial complex for the assurance that meat is supervised in a kosher way. Now,
but what I'm saying though is that it's one thing to say that the kosher industrial complex, all things being equal, if we want to get kosher food, we have to do it that way. If what they're doing is actually grounded in, authority. But if it's really grounded in a kind of elitism that comes from Jews becoming wealthier and being able to make these fine distinctions, it starts to become less persuasive as the way to be kosher. And then you say to somebody, okay, look, at the end of the day, maybe it really is just as kosher to buy organic food that was grass-fed beef, et cetera. It's not that it's more kosher than what you're getting at the kosher market, but it's not necessarily less kosher because both of them are extreme in a certain way that the rules don't really require.
Okay, so what I hear you saying, Dan, is that you have a problem with elitism.
Yeah, well, that's what what I'm wondering is, I think people would think about kosher laws and about like Jewish eating differently if we framed it as a question of elitism versus, the common people or making Judaism affordable. That would be a different framing than one that says it's what God wants versus, sins.
One of the other points that I make pertains to your point, Dan, and that is it's an elitism in context. It's an elitism, and maybe I would choose a different word. In a world that says you're crap, you are not a dignified person, you are lower and lesser, because you rejected our Lord or whatever. And that's in medieval Christian world. The rabbinic authorities, especially the mystical ones who I love, were basically saying, no, you are special. We are learned. Our learnedness, in fact, makes us have a higher status in the scheme of things. I mean, I don't think, we should go around. I mean, there are definitely problematic aspects of saying, lording it over people. But at the same time, to compensate for people saying that you're crap, that particularly the mystic notions of doing these powerful repairs or tikkunim in the world, that your actions can actually affect the cosmos, is a way of, making the powerless feel really powerful. That is psychologically healthy and necessary and beautiful.
Yeah, first off, little wordplay moment. I'm noticing for the first time, because you were talking about forks before and how for me also, like Dan, it was this mind blown moment of first step, oh my gosh, we didn't have forks for most of history. And second step of course we didn't have forks. Like I just had never thought about it, but like once you realize it, you're like, yeah, well, how would they, like, why would they have had forks? But that was like forks. If you were to spell out the word fork or forks in Hebrew, it would be a pei. It would be the letter pei at the beginning, and it would actually be the same spelling as pork. So I'm just noticing for the first time that fork and pork are in effect sharing
I'm seeing
root.
a culinary midrash coming together right
That's
here.
exactly what I was thinking. I love it.
And by the way, I'm going to connect this to my whole thing about how impossible pork is kosher and blah, 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 but that's a separate thing. I do have a question.
By the way, that really bothers me. I mean, I don't care whether it has a hex or not, because I'm looking for it in the stores and I just haven't found it yet. I'm all in with impossible pork.
Join the movement. We've unofficially started to rally some troops through some of our episodes. So that's not where my question is going, is the forks and pork thing. But if that connects, great. The question I do have, it's bringing us back to the wine question, but in a sense that I think is sort of a synthesis question, because there's a bunch of questions at play with food and Judaism, right? Is it Jewish, or how is it Jewish, right? And we've talked a little bit about the labeling and how, like, part of what we do as Jews is we midrash, we drash on things, and we claim them as Jewish. So there's the, like, is it Jewish food question. There's also the is it kosher food question. And like we just said with the impossible pork, there's complicated questions within that, because even for people who share a general sense of what kosher means, there's still debates about whether something like impossible pork is kosher. But I want to bring up wine, because I have a personal practice that I've actually mentioned on the podcast in the past. When I have control over the situation, I do not drink kosher wine. In any situation where I have a choice between non-kosher wine and kosher wine, I drink the non-kosher wine. And when I say kosher and non-kosher, I'm referring to the classical definition of what those things mean. And the reason for that is all of what you said before about what's happening underneath kosher wine, right? Like the whole reason for it is, in my view, a xenophobic approach to Jewish practice that I don't want to be part of. Now, I've had different moments on my journey where at some points in the past, I have made the claim, non-kosher wine is kosher and kosher wine is unkosher from my perspective. And what I mean by that is, like, I think kosher as a term should refer to like foods that align with values I think are good values. And I think non-kosher wine, because it's not operating from that xenophobic place, I see more like that. But I'm more and more reaching a place where I actually don't think that I'm here for the argument of non-kosher wine should be kosher. What I'm here for is, like, non-kosher wine is Jewish. And I'm not doing, and I want to be clear, I'm not doing it from a defensive place. It's not that I don't think I have the right. It's not that I don't think I couldn't enter the battleground of what is or is not kosher food. I think everybody who has a relationship to Jewish food can, if they would like to, be in that argument. I just don't. I no longer feel that bad or good if something I feel a deep connection to is kosher or not, because I actually have questions about the broader categories of how kashrut was constructed. And so for me, it's more about what's Jewish or not. And so I'd love to hear from you to the extent that distinction uplifts certain arguments of your own, how you'd approach it.
So I really like that you're posing that as a question, and I like your solution to it, but maybe for different reasons. Kosher is kosher, and it means something. And there are very offensive aspects of it. And as part of my general interest in my current interest in telling food stories, is I want my food stories to tell the good and the bad. I don't want to throw out kosher. If there are offensive aspects about kosher, I don't want to call something kosher that, according to rabbinic authorities, oppressive as they might be, and and as much as I might disagree with them, they're calling kosher. Because and even when you say kosher in the classical sense, it isn't kosher in the classical sense. It's kosher in the sense that the current authority structure of people who get to say things are kosher make it kosher. And as far as I'm concerned, so impossible pork is an interesting issue, because I don't really care that they're not going to give it a hechsher, because I know, from the point of view of Jewish law, it is kosher. So, I don't have to respect their authority. But on the other hand, I realize that they are trying to assert it in that area. And so that is reality. And I'm not going to blur over that part of Jewish history. And I'm not going to blur over the part of Jewish history that has had offensive attitudes towards Gentiles. I'm not going to try to continue those practices, but I'm not going to change the names because I think we need to remember that's part of, it's the same thing like, are we going to, cut out any reference to the slave trade in American history? And in fact, my book, one of the things I'm really interested in my reconstructing Thanksgiving is making sure that the stories are more like the story of the Hillel sandwich than of the than Norman Rockwell's picture of white people sitting around a Thanksgiving table. There's pain and blood and suffering that goes in our history, and if we're going to tell the story and celebrate where we are now, we have to tell we have to integrate the whole story. The other thing, though, is you use the word play. And this is not the direction that
I used the word play. I used the word wordplay.
Yes.
And then you just did a wordplay on the word wordplay. I used the word play.
That is probably the most crucial element of Midrash in my subtitle. To me, Midrash is Jewish play. Okay. And it's interesting because, and you even talked about, we're always drashing something. That is a word we used when we are adapting a recipe. Okay. We use that all the time in our kitchen at home. Okay, well, this is a recipe, but we're going to drosh it a little bit by putting this in and that. And that is what I'm thinking is that, not only are we, we're doing all the adapting things and we're doing all the things with fusion, but it's fun. It's playful. This stuff is great. That's why it's meaningful to me. I love making the adaptation. My daughter has a food blog called Kimchi and Kishka, and it's all about fusion. And my kids both eat like glatt treif. I have to translate that. It's untranslatable, but glatt is the term that refers to like an extra stringent degree of kashrut. It has to do with the smoothness of the organs and stuff like that. But whatever. So for me to say glatt treif, that is an oxymoron.
Like devout atheist.
But they're also very interested in, they make the holidays. They want to have Jewish food for the holidays. They love fusion. They love making up things. They love adapting things. And my daughter is often saying, well, here, this is the way we do it, but mom and dad, or you could use this, and you can this will make it kosher for you, or this will make it vegetarian for you, so you could do it this way because you don't eat the pork that we're eating. So that's where I would like things to go, is respect. There are different ways of being Jewish, and I love her way of being Jewish. I love my son's way of being Jewish. They're not the same way as ours, but they all involve playing with the tradition. They all involve doing this kind of adapting, fusing, but in a way that is thoughtful and creative and imaginative and tasty and playful. Whether that's with food or whether it's with the text of the Torah, or that is, to me, that's quintessentially Jewish too. And also, it's what makes it fun being Jewish. I mean, let's be real. I'm all about Judaism being all about play, not about suffering. I mean, not that that's not part of our history, but look, we even play with that. I think irreverent and gallows Jewish humor is like one of the greatest contributions we have made to like Jewish culture. And those are the reasons to be Jewish, not because we think everyone is out to get us, but because we find it richly rewarding to have this tradition that we can play with, and even a tragic history that we find it rewarding to play with a little bit, to make our lives meaningful and on the food level and tasty.
Yeah, and so maybe just to tie a bow on all this, I'm just thinking about, first of all, I'll say that I think these are both the words of God. I disagree a little bit on the question of whether we should call something kosher or not. only in the sense that I think a lot about how, there's a biblical version of all the holidays and then there's a rabbinic version of all the holidays. They didn't say, let's give this holiday in the springtime a different name. They said that was Passover and this is Passover, and so I can imagine that we have, there was a rabbinic version of kosher and now there's going to be a post-rabbinic version of kosher. And we don't have to argue about it. I mean, I just for me, that's where I'm.
I actually, I like your example and I like your analogies, and I would probably be selective about what I want to rename and what I don't, because I think that has been a very, very important strategy in Jewish Midrash over the years, is especially with the Passover Seder, is to argue that even though everything has changed, nothing has changed. We're just going to call it okay, I even left this out. I love this. There are three things that you need to say to fulfill your obligation: Pesach, matzah, and maror. And then we go eat all three, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
really?
No, you don't eat the Pesach.
Right.
It depends on what you're thinking. A Pesach being it's hard to translate because you have to choose your era to translate
the Passover sacrifice.
But it's there, and that's what it means. And the Haggadah mentions it all the time. But it pretends that we, it in some ways it is totally shaped by the fact of this mythic turning point in Jewish history of the destruction of the temple and the loss of all of the ways that we were able to interact with God when we had the temple. And yet we, and so the essential, what do we call the damn holiday? It's Pesach, okay? Mm-hmm. But we don't even eat the Pesach because history was bad to us. Nonetheless, we act like we're celebrating redemption, despite the fact that we can't even do one of the three main things that we're supposed to do on the holiday. And I love that. Obvious selective erasure. I mean, it's not erasure because it's gone. It's there. I mean, it's all there. It's just that nobody ever says, oh, wait a minute, we're not eating this Pesach. But we're not.
So I love the idea of a Jewish eating ethic. I think it's really interesting to take your eating seriously, not only in religious ways, but also in ways that it gets you to think. Like if we use food as a vehicle for thinking, I think it's really excited. I want to call that kosher. Like when you said all of Jewish food is fusion, I think you said all of Judaism is fusion. I was like, all of Jewish practice is fusion, right there. In the same way that there's no Jewish food that's purely Jewish, except, as you said, for the Hillel sandwich, there's no Jewish practice that is inherently Jewish.
It's not even, I would never say that it's purely Jewish. I would say it's quintessentially Jewish because it's quintessentially fusion.
Right. But so what I want to just explore, like just as a last question, is just that, maybe there's a way in which we are being insufficiently self-conscious of American Judaism, in the sense that we are not thinking, for example, as I understood this, and I learned this from the Adventures in Jewish Studies podcast of the Association for Jewish Studies, this really hit me in the same way that your book hit me about the forks, that lox is a quintessentially American Jewish food, in part because Jews in Europe mostly could not afford to buy lox. So the idea that lox, like a smoked fish, would be a widespread Jewish food, it doesn't mean some people didn't eat it, but that there would be a widespread food. Actually, no, it was actually from Scandinavia. And I feel like most American Jews think of it as like some version of something that came over from the old country. And because we are not sort of able to, in a way that we're proud of, really talk about this emergent American Judaism that is just as fusion, but in a good way, as every previous form of Judaism, there may be a way in which we're not actually grasping with both hands the creative possibility that we have.
Right. No, that's really interesting. That's totally the point of the paper, or at least one of the main points of the paper that my daughter Zoya and I are writing together, is that, whether she's saying it about Chinese American food, famous things like General Tso's chicken, and I'm saying about babka and rugelach, is that these fusion foods are delicious. They're great. Why are we, thinking that they're somehow lesser? Of course, one could argue this is kind of like the Bund ideal of Doigkeit.
Here-ness.
We can be Jewish where we are. And again, I think that's also kind of part of the whole point of doing a book on gastronomic Judaism, is that we don't need to feel that what we are doing is lesser than what the old people did. We need to recognize our need to attach something old to it. And I think that in that sense, I think Midrash is the fusion of old and new, as well as here and there. And it is essential for Jews to always think that there is something old that we're carrying over. It doesn't, because otherwise it doesn't have the resonance of depth, that we're part of something bigger than we are if we don't have some explicit memory of something older. But there's two sides to it. I mean, there's also what we're making new. It is old and new. And we shouldn't assume that because we've innovated that it has destroyed its value because it's an innovation. It's and I think often our culture goes the other extreme, and the only thing good is innovation. Again, the Hillel sandwich. It's got to be both. It's got to be. We have to taste both. We have to taste history and the present.
Wow. Thank you so much. I love that closing note, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. This was I love talking about this stuff, but I love having wonderful people to talk with about these passions and who get it.
And it was a pleasure for us to talk with you about your passions too. So now to the listeners, we are so grateful to you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. Also, encouraging you to keep listening with us through this unit on Jewish food and our episodes in the future. But also, send us a note, send us a question, a thought, a comment, a gripe, whatever you've got. Be in touch. Here are the ways you can do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And third, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 100.